So firstly, I should say, given time constraints, we can barely scratch the surface of coffee, since human relationships with coffee have dated back over 1,000 years ago. But I'm going to start with Mark Pendergast, who in 2010 described how coffee was one of the various plants that drew European settlers to the Southern Hemisphere to claim ownership of its value and the land on which it can grow. Coffee was of particular interest as well because it required less processing or production versus other goods such as sugar or spirits. Coffee remained as one of the material drivers that shaped land rights issues and injustices in the global South, which carries on today. Neocolonialism and neoliberalism have drastically shaped how coffee transformed mountainsides in various southern tropical areas, often, as we shall hear, having had devastating environmental and social results, situating wealth next to dire poverty. And as you guys, my classmates, will remember, Paul Robbins described how political ecology related environmental and social issues should focus on a more contextual approach, identifying broader systems at play rather than blaming the proximate population like a lot of traditional ways of thinking do. I think it's important to acknowledge the problematic romanticized perceptions of coffee, as they often or almost always neglect to accurately reflect the historical and modern land rights issues faced by Indigenous and African communities who share that passionate traditional knowledge of coffee agriculture, but are restricted by multinational corporations and policies that control the land and market. Especially as described by Harvey and al. In 2021, over the last few decades, lowering coffee prices, changing climates, new and more severe plant pathogen outbreaks, and various other environmental issues continue to cause rapid and profound biophysical changes to not only the coffee farms themselves, but to landscapes across these southern farming regions.
Neoliberal policies are quite complementary with capitalism and foreign investments that extract wealth out of the global South and into the global North. For example, we saw in this class how Canada is highly involved in this with the extractive mining industry in Latin America, which is directly involved in land grabs from Indigenous communities. This isn't something that's unique to the extractive industry. It happens with coffee too. Coffee has been a central commodity exported by Latin America for a long time. In the 1960s, a set of international coffee agreements was implemented to regulate prices and supply. But changes associated with the transition of economic liberalization in the region with the onset of neoliberal values was responsible for the breakdown of this agreement and the rise in power and profits achieved by global North-based multinational corporations. These changes during economic liberalization also altered land ownership, and coffee production became entangled in the domination of agro-elites. For example, it's been noted that profits among Brazilian producers decreased from 20% of sales in the 70s to 13% in the 90s, while simultaneously those in consuming countries saw an increase in their profits related to the coffee trade. So right here, we're seeing the manipulation of land ownership and concentrations of wealth that mirror colonial history in the way that neoliberal policies have allowed the global North to extract wealth from the global South and expand control over land. Now, that was my little part. I'll pass it on to Kirsten.
Next, we have the impact of air, water, and land pollution. These sources are coming from the usage of agrochemicals such as pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. As stated by the UN Environment Program report on coffee production in Vietnam, 1/2 to 1/3 of these chemicals are not going into the plants and instead are a product of runoff. But since Vietnam is the second largest exporter of coffee, we're seeing how the farmers feel the pressure to optimize on the crop value. So they're continuing to use chemicals regardless of their negative impact. Last is the issue of waste creation, which connects to pollution. We're seeing how high usages of water is required for the wet milling process and how water is being wasted after it's contaminated with leftover coffee pulp. It's problematic because the cherry that the bean is located in is not being used, and clean water is being diverted away from local communities who need it. So instead, the additional waste is being dumped and heavily polluting our waterways. A study in India highlighted how this was affecting local communities as the pollution was causing chronic health issues such as irritation, stomach problems, breathing problems, and nausea. So this large overarching issue with the industrialization of coffee production is how it's unsustainable. We are seeing the outcome of multiple emerging environmental issues and how it's impacting marginalized communities. Seen with local communities, their ecosystem services are being taken away along with the right to their land. Degradation is exacerbating the uneven development as the wealthy consuming nations are benefiting off of the exploitation of others' land, and communities are left to deal with the repercussions. It's also problematic as we're seeing coffee producing nations favoring economic profit over the health of its people, and they're failing to implement strict policies to protect communities.
And so fair trade emerged as an attempt to pay coffee producers more and to limit the amount of market instability, as when crops were good and there was a lot of coffee, the price of coffee would often go down because there's more accessibility. And when crops weren't as good and there wasn't as much, coffee prices would go up. This fluctuation was really harmful for the communities and for the farmers themselves because they didn't have much stability and they didn't know how much they were going to be able to make from their coffee. And so fair trade came in as an attempt to regulate this. It essentially stated that individuals and farmers within cooperatives could apply for fair trade status so long as they met a certain amount of environmental and social standards. And if their coffee was deemed fair trade, they would get a base pay per weight of coffee beans that they were selling. So while this was a standard that genuinely was trying to create a positive difference in the coffee world, it did fall short in many ways, and it has continued to fall short ever since. So one of the biggest issues is that fair trade is no longer a single standard. It used to be. It used to be a single reputable standard that would, a certification that would be done by what used to be called Transfair and is now Fair Trade USA. But it isn't that anymore. Fair trade has become kind of a blanket statement that any producers can put on their coffee. As can be seen within Fair Trade USA certification standards, large organizations like Starbucks or places like Tim Hortons cannot claim to have fair trade. And as we've seen in marketing, a lot of large organizations do claim to have fair trade because they pay their farmers well. Unfortunately, that is not enough.